Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today, we are going to be chatting all about burnout, the symptoms of it, the causes of it, and what you can do to help minimize burnout at your workplace. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey leaders, I'm your coach Adam, here to have an honest talk about leadership, the obstacles you might face, and how to refine your leadership skills to help you become the leader I know you are. So let's grab a drink, sit back, relax, and have a chat. Alright, so let's hop right into it and start chatting about burnout. And so, interestingly enough, oh hi Gary, that's my kitty cat. Interestingly enough, when it comes to burnout, I've talked with a lot of leaders and they definitely seem to be in the minority, but it's important that we address it. There's this idea that burnout isn't actually a real thing, that burnout is a mental health thing that people have kind of made up. What's interesting about this is that it's not true. Burnout is actually a mental health issue that the World Health Organization has already defined. And there is some debate about burnout, but it's not about if burnout exists or not. The consensus in the mental health community is that burnout is 100% a real thing, and we've already defined it, and we know kind of the causes and symptoms of burnout. And so the World Health Organization specifically defines burnout as being caused by chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And I got that quote off of the World Health Organization website. And so what's interesting to note here is that we're talking chronic stress. So anytime we use the word chronic in the medical field, we're talking about longer than 6 months. So acute, typically shorter than 6 months, chronic, longer than 6 months. And it's specifically in the workplace environment. And that's very important because as leaders, we're leading our people essentially at the workplace. And so burnout is caused by the job. It's not caused outside the job, it's caused inside the job. And that's very important to note. And so kind of stepping back a little bit, and remember how I said there was a bit of a discussion about burnout. The discussion about burnout is in regards to if it's actually depression or if it's a subsidiary of depression. And the reasoning that there's this discussion is because a lot of the signs and symptoms of burnout are very similar to depression, but not really. And so there's this debate going on in the mental health community about, is burnout a part of depression or is it its own thing? But that's a little bit too far in depth for our discussion today because let's be honest, I only have 25 minutes to cover a very detailed subject, as with all these podcasts. So today, for our purposes, we're just going to focus more on the fact that burnout is caused by unmanaged chronic workplace stress. So now that we know what burnout is, let's talk a little bit about what burnout actually looks like. Because a lot of people will say that they're burnt out. They'll come to me and they say, Adam, I'm really burnt out, but they're not actually burnt out. They're just kind of fed up with their job. And there's a big difference between just being angry and being tired and actually just being burnt out. And so the symptoms of burnout are kind of in 4 areas. So the first one is just a lack of energy and feeling tired all the time. And we're not talking a depressive energy that falls into, I want to kill myself. It's just more you wake up and you're exhausted. You go to work and you're tired, but you're still able to do your job. And that distinction is really important because remember how I said that there's some discussion about, is burnout a part of depression? Well, in depression, you also have that lack of energy and you feel this giant fatigue and exhaustion to the point that you just can't get out of bed and you're just sleeping all the time. So again, Still lack of energy, but we're not into depression lack of energy. The second sign or symptom is generally a lack of empathy. But it's not only a lack of empathy for the people around you, but also for yourself. Because you have to keep in mind that when you're burnt out, you don't actually have the emotional bandwidth to take care of anybody. You can barely keep care of yourself. And so this kind of can come across, or if you are burnt out and you have that lack of empathy, it can sometimes come across as you being cold and callous and very uncaring. And it's fascinating to watch. I know I myself have been burnt out before, actually a couple of times, because the healthcare profession is quite rough. And what's interesting is when you have this lack of empathy for people, you could hear the most heart-wrenching thing in the world, and you really just don't care. And you just kind of shrug your shoulders and go, sucks to suck. And then you just move on because you have to. You have to get through your shift and go home and get through another day. And again, you come across as this very cold and uncaring person, somebody who doesn't really have a heart or a soul, as some would call it. But the truth of the matter is that you're just exhausted, you're tired, and you don't have the bandwidth to talk to anybody. But then on top of that, and this is important, not only do you have a lack of empathy for the people around you, you have a lack of empathy for yourself. And so this really can come across as you talking about really how good your life is and how you don't have a reason to complain, and that being a hard worker is just a part of normal routine. Like you don't step back and you can't say to yourself, wow, I'm doing a really good job, or wow, I'm really hurting. Like you can't do that. You just have this lack of empathy. You just don't give two shits about anyone around you or yourself, because let's be honest, you can't. You're burnt out. But then what comes across next is cynicism. And it's this view of the world that things won't work out. And this is going to be different from suicide or depression, in that in suicide and depression, you think that the world is better off without you. And that's kind of goes down a really dark hole. But when it comes to cynicism, you believe that it doesn't actually matter what you do at your job, things won't get better. It doesn't matter if the length or the amount of time or energy you put in, nothing will get better and everything is kind of doomed to fail. So why bother? And it's that really negative view of the world that you start having. And lastly, one of the signs of burnout is just a lack of fulfillment at your job. You could have an amazing job that's paying you six-figure income that is helping to transform and revolutionize the world. But if you're burnt out, you, on paper, this is the best job ever, but you yourself don't care about it. It's unfulfilling, it's unrewarding, and you just don't enjoy it at all. And to kind of help put this all into context, I'll tell you about the time that I burnt out. And it was not that much fun. So I was a relatively new nurse. I was about 4 or 5 years into the profession, and I had been dealing with incredible amounts of stress and hearing incredibly disturbing things at my work and having to do things that I myself was not emotionally or physically kind of prepared for, more emotionally prepared for than physically. And I had been doing this for such a long time that it was actually starting to get to me. And what was interesting is when I look back, I was like, well, of course I burnt out. Everyone in that industry burnt out. The average lifespan of a housing first worker was 4 years. 4 years, and then you burnt completely out. And what was interesting is I remember being burnt out, but not actually knowing that I'm burnt out. Like, I was just tired all the time. I just didn't want to do anything. I remember going to morning meetings with my cup of tea and just sitting there, just being like, I don't want to get out of this chair, and I just don't want to do anything. I would go home after work and I would just like put on Netflix and just stare at the TV because I just couldn't drag myself off of the couch. I was just exhausted. It was just this general feeling of just fatigue. But not only was it fatigue, I didn't give two shits about anybody. Like, I would hear some of the most disturbing stuff and I wouldn't care. An example of this is that I was told that one of my clients was going to die. He had both of his legs amputated. He was smoking. He was doing horrendously awful things to his body. And it kind of got to the point that we were looking at putting him into palliative care. And we had to have this uncomfortable conversation where I had to sit down with him and be like, hey man, you're gonna die. So I need to know what you want us to do for your funeral, because the last thing we need is for you to pass away and us not know what the hell you wanted to do, which actually happened quite a bit in the program that I was working with. But when I got told that this person is dying, I had no sympathy for this man. Like, I just didn't care. And it wasn't that I was a bad person. It was just that I couldn't care. My emotional bandwidth was at its wit's end. I had recently dealt with a suicide, and then I had dealt with a person that got raped, and then I got dealt with another person that was in jail for attempted murder. So I was dealing with a really heavy caseload, and then when I got told that, hey, you have to plan this entire funeral for this person, my first thought was like, oh shit, this is going to be so much work, as opposed to, hey, that's awful. Maybe I should go about this in a very delicate way. But again, that just didn't really cross my mind at the time because I was severely burnt out. And then on top of that, I did not have any sympathy for me. I personally was working myself to the bone and working myself quite hard. And I was often telling myself little lies and fairy tales about my job, talking about how it's an amazing job, how it's really a learning opportunity, and what I'm suffering from is just first world problems, and that my emotions and what I was feeling really should be pushed off into the background. It was a very weird feeling just to have this severe lack of empathy for not only everyone around me, but also for myself. And then I also had built up a hugely cynical view of the world. I was very cynical of my family. I always felt that they were going to manipulate me, that I could do no good. I felt that my managers were always going to be screwing us over, because at the end of the day, they were always looking out for themselves, and who the hell cared about us. And I was looking at politics and in regards with voting as like, who the hell cares about who wins or loses? We're screwed at the end of the day. It doesn't really much matter. And so there's this just negative view of everything around me. And people would point out and be like, you're very cynical. And I'd look at them and be like, I'm not cynical. I'm a realist. This is just how the world works. And what was interesting is you couldn't argue with me at this point. If you attempted to tell me that my worldview wasn't right, I could tell you how your worldview is wrong and bullshit. And so arguing with me when I was that far deep into burnout about how good the world was a colossal waste of your time. And even now I'll admit it, I wouldn't have done it. But hey, don't let me stop you from living out your dreams and arguing with somebody who's super cynical and burnt out. Just be aware that it might be a waste of your time. And then to kind of get into the last kind of symptom of it was the lack of fulfillment at my job. Like, I used to love my job. I used to be excited to go to work every day. It was a very challenging job. It was a very interesting job. Oh, hey, Gary. Gary's climbing on me. But when it came to me now enjoying my job, I had simply stopped enjoying it altogether. I know what you're thinking. Adam, why don't you just change jobs? Well, it might not necessarily be that easy, especially if it's not specifically a job problem, but an industry problem. And that is a whole different kettle of fish to kind of get into. So we'll keep it a little bit more narrow in that. But that's kind of my own personal experience with burnout. And I really didn't get better until I had switched to 3 different jobs, and I had to take a major step back and put some major boundaries in place. So, but before we kind of get into that conversation, let's take a look at kind of the causes of burnout. Like, how the hell do you get to that point of just fatigue, exhaustion, cynicism, lack of empathy, and just not liking your job? So when we take a look at burnout, the reason why people get burnt out in the easiest way to describe it is burnout occurs when really good people are attempting to do an impossible job. And what I mean by that is that there are factors that are standing in your way and keeping you from doing the job that you want to do. And really, they kind of boil down into 6 factors. And so the first one we're going to talk about is simply workload. Sometimes there's just more work than you have hours available. An example of this is in long-term care centers in the medical field. A nurse will be given about 16 hours worth of work, but they'll be given 8 hours to complete that work. It's just physically impossible to complete all that work because, let's be honest, you're asking for 16 hours worth of work, but you're only giving me 8 hours. Like, you just can't do it. So when we work in that leadership position, we need to be very aware of workload and making sure that the work that we are giving our people is reasonable. The next part of burnout is control. And control typically takes the form of management micromanaging their people. And if this is you, it's time to pump the brakes and stop micromanaging your people. If you have time to micromanage your people, that means that your position is probably a useless position and you should essentially be removed. I'm sorry to tell you that. I've yet to see a leader that has time to both micromanage and do their job at the same time. It just doesn't really happen. But micromanaging leaders definitely are a cause of burnout. The next one is reward. And it comes down to, are you paying, if it's a job, are you paying your employees adequately for what you're asking them to do? And sometimes you're not. And sometimes you're asking your employees to do incredibly dangerous things for very little pay, which in turn means that they're going to be upset. It's going to start creating that burnout scenario. But not only that, are you rewarding your team appropriately? And so what I mean by that is not all your team members want more money. Sometimes they want words of affirmation. Be like, hey, Jim, you did a really good job at the da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Sometimes it's a gift. I know for myself, if my manager ever came over and was like, hey, I know you noticed you did a really good job presenting to those students. Here's a can of Dr. Pepper. I'd be over the moon by that. So you need to get to know your team and how they want to be rewarded. Some people just want a day off. Other people do a really good job and they want to be rewarded with courses. They want to be rewarded with actual learning material. So be aware. Maybe you're not rewarding your people the way that you should be or paying them the way that they should be. Another one is community. This is a big problem for many, many jobs at the moment, and that is the workers are too isolated. They're on their own by themselves. And we actually need, as leaders, to build up the community. We need to build our team. We need to do those team building events. We need to create artificial environments for our team to come together and talk to each other and get to know each other. And this is where very informal team building events are awesome. I know that some of my best memories come from my manager coming in and saying, hey guys, I know this is a holiday that you're all working. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to buy you all pizza and be in the break room at noon. And we're just going to sit around and eat pizza. And we're just going to take an hour off. Everyone's taking an hour off just to have some pizza. And that was an amazing team building event because I still remember just sitting around with my colleagues and coworkers and getting to know who they were. But our job is to really foster that community and get to help our people get to know each other and build up that teamwork. The next point is fairness. Are we treating our people fair? Is the system fair? Are we favoriting somebody else above everyone else? And that is problematic. If people perceive the system to be unfair, if people see that we are being unfair, it starts creating this burnout dynamic. So we need to be very aware that we ourselves have to be fair. And then the last factor of burnout or causing burnout is the issue of values. Sometimes the job's values and the employee values simply don't line up. And it's our job as a leader to try to bridge that gap, to try to bridge those values. And an example of values being very important at a job is first and foremost when we look at nursing, because that is my background. My value is that I want to take care of clients. I value my client interactions. I'm there to take care of them. I'm there to help them live their best life. I'm there to help them heal, and I'm there to help them kind of move forward in whatever direction they want to go to. That's very important to me, is helping people. But at the jobs that I tend to work out, they value the almighty dollar. What they care more about is having me complete surveys, collect data, looking at statistics, doing meetings, all in the pursuit to persuade the government that their program deserves the amount of funding to keep it open. But here's the rub. I, as the employee, don't give two shits about funding. Funding is a management issue that the managers have to sort out themselves. And I only care about funding because my managers tell me I should care about funding. But it's not part of my value. It's this separation of these two values. My value is to care and take care of my patients. Their value is money and keep the program open. And as leaders, we need to bridge these two values. We need to have people come to the table or bring the parties to the table and say, hey, I know you want to take care of people. I know that this is really important to you. And the statistics side of things is not your jam. So maybe we can look at hiring somebody that will deal with the statistics side of things and use programs that allow us to pull the data. That way you can focus on the values that are important to you, and then management can have their stats, their surveys done, and then they can worry about that. And so that's when we start seeing values lining up at a job. And again, as leaders, we have to be aware. Are the values of the company and are the values of our employees lining up? Because if they're not, why aren't they? What's going on there? And then the second question we need to ask is, how do we bridge that gap? So to kind of walk it back a little bit, we talked a lot about burnout. We talked about the signs and symptoms of burnout, and we talked about the 6 causes of it. To kind of give you really 3 steps to move forward with it is, first and foremost, if you start noticing that there are multiple people burning out at your job or your place of employment or the group that you're with, the first thing you must do is take a step back and ask why. What is going on? look through the 6 factors. Look at workload. Look at control. Look at the rewards you're giving out. Do you have a community? Are you doing team building events? How fair is your system? What are the values going on there? And really look at that. And then the next point is target the area that you want to start working on. So let's say you actually have problems in 4 of those factors. Well, don't start on all 4. Start on 1 or 2, focus, get those factors working, and then move on to the next. But please keep in mind that if you have burnt out workers, they're going to be incredibly cynical and they're going to be hard to come to the table because, again, they're burnt out. This isn't their fault. This is your fault. You didn't fix these problems in a timely manner, and so now we're kind of suffering the consequences. But the thing is that if we're able to fix these areas slowly but surely, they will come out of that burnout cycle. And then lastly, and this is kind of going to be very important, is sometimes we as leaders have to start implementing boundaries for our people and start telling them what not to do. And I know what you're thinking, doesn't this fall into control and micromanagement? Well, yes, but also no. Because the thing to think about is if we have a workload issue, there is also a personal, individual side to this. Maybe the person feels an emotional obligation to work later. Maybe they feel like they should take on too much or that they should take on more projects and ultimately take on too much. And it's our job as leaders to recognize that this is a potential issue and potentially being very direct with them and saying, no, I'm not going to allow you to take on that. No, you're not allowed to work past these hours. No, you're not allowed to do this. And they might hate you for it, but ultimately what we are trying to do is we're trying to build a healthy workforce to help your team be the best that it can be. So I hope that helped, and I shall see you guys in the next episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, give it a like, and share it with a friend. And if you're ready to take the next leap and improve your leadership skills, head over to www.seatingthelead.com and book your free coaching session today. There we go, Gary. Mandatory snuggle time. I know.